This is the first part of a series of the anatomy of the cranial nerves. In this part, we are going to correlate the functions of these cranial nerves embryologically and describe the nuclear origin, the nuclei of origin of all the cranial nerves, except the first, the second, and the eighth cranial nerve, which they have a special pathway. Starting by a developmental background to understand the functions of those cranial nerves. Here on the left side, there's a diagram showing the germinal disc by the end of the third week. What you can see here in the middle line will be the notochord and the neural tube, and on each side the intra-embryonic mesoderm is divided into three columns: a para-axial one, intermediate cell mass, and lateral cell mass. The para-axial mesoderm, as you can see, have been divided into what we call it mesodermal somites. And these somites corresponds to the region. We have some occipital somites, which are around 5 or 6 somites, cervical 8, which correspond to the 8 cervical nerves, thoracic 12 corresponding to the 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar also correspond to the lumbar nerves, and sacral 5 and coccygeal around 3 or 4. That is the mesodermal somites on each side of the middle line. The intermediate cell mass will form what we call it the nephrogenic cord. Its name is telling that it will develop into the urogenital system. The lateral cell mass will show small cavities which will unite or coalesce to form one cavity, which is the intra-embryonic cellome, an inverted U, as you can see here. In the middle line will form the pericardium, that is the first cavity. On each side, the two pleura cavities, and below will be the two peritoneal recesses, which will unite to form the peritoneal cavity. The most cranial part of the interembryonic mesoderm will be forming what we call it the septum transversum. This is the site of the precordial plate, and this is the site of the cloacal membrane, and this is the connecting stalk. We must study a horizontal section and transverse section to understand the development of all the systems of the body. Here we are going to study or to show only the transverse section. Here is the ectoderm, the outer layer, and this is the endoderm, and that is the neural tube and the notochord in the middle line. On each side of the neural tube will be the two neural crests, then the mesodermal somite, part of the para-axial mesoderm, nephrogenic cord, the intermediate one, and the two recesses of the peritoneum, which will unite to form the peritoneal cavity. That is the cavity of the yolk sac. The start of folding by the end of the third week will contain the yolk sac to form the primitive gut. That is the transverse section. The important part here to understand for the cranial nerves or the functions of them is that the interembryonic cellum have two walls, which is mesodermal, of course. The outer one close to the ectoderm, which we call it the somatic mesoderm, and the inner one close to the endoderm, which we call it the splanchnic mesoderm. The splanchnoblur and the somatoblur. These are the two parts of the wall of the intraembryonic coelom. Those parts which are the ectoderm and the somatic mesoderm would be supplied by somatic nerves, while the inner one, the splanchnic mesoderm and the endoderm, any structures developing from these two parts will be the visceral part. So we have a somatic part, any structure developing from the ectoderm and the somatic mesoderm will be supplied by somatic nerves, and those developing from the endoderm and the splanchnoblur will be the visceral part of the nerves. That is the base on which we divide the cranial nerves function into somatic and visceral, as we will see in the next slide. Let's start by how these cranial nerves are divided functionally. There is two main groups as any nerves, the efferent group or the motor, the afferent one, which are the sensory one. Starting by the motor part, the efferent, as the other one, it is divided into somatic and visceral. So the afferent are also divided into visceral and somatic parts. So we have four subgroups from the motor and the sensory groups. For the motor or the efferent fiber, the somatic is only one group, which we call it general, or somatic motor without general. While the visceral is divided into special and general. So there is special visceral motor or efferent and general visceral motor or efferent. So there are three groups of motor fibers within the cranial nerves. When it comes to the afferent or the sensory, the two groups, the visceral and somatic, each one will be divided into general and special types. So it ends up by four groups of sensory: general visceral afferent, special visceral afferent, general somatic afferent, and special somatic afferent. In total, there are 7 columns of cranial nerve nuclei, and they are usually arranged from medial to lateral in the brainstem, as it's shown up from number 1 to number 7. That's how, again, developmentally, the arrangement of the 7 columns in the brainstem are like what we can see now. In the spinal cord, we have, as we said, an alar lamina, which is the sensory part, and basal lamina, that is the mantle layer, which is divided into a sensory and motor areas. That's in the spinal cord, early spinal cord. When the medulla starts to be opened, the motor becomes the medial part and the sensory becomes the lateral part. That is the early brainstem. As you can see here, from medial to lateral is the same as the previous 7 groups: the general, somatic, the special visceral, and the general visceral efferent or motor, then the general visceral and the special visceral, the general somatic and the special somatic afferent or sensory fibers. So it starts here by the motor part, the somatic, and then the visceral. In the sensory part, start by the visceral, then the somatic. That is the arrangement in the brainstem. Now, we would like to get two other things. We'll try to enumerate the cranial nerves under each column. The first column is the general somatic efferent, those, as we said, the muscles which does not arise from the pharyngeal arches. The eye will be supplied by the third, fourth, and sixth, and the tongue will be by the 12th cranial nerve. The second group, the special visceral efferent, which arise from the arches. The first arch by the trigeminal or the mandibular division of the trigeminal. The second arch by the facial. The third arch by the glossopharyngeal, while the vagus and the accessory, the cranial part of accessory, for the fourth and the sixth arches. The parasympathetic or the general visceral efferent are found in 4 cranial nerves: the third, oculomotor, the fourth and the seventh, the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. The general visceral afferent fibers, again in the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus, while the special visceral afferent, the smell by number 1, olfactory, the taste by the 7th, the 9th, and the vagus. The general somatic, which are the exteroceptives, by the trigeminal mainly, and the glossopharyngeal and the vagus. The special somatic afferent, the vision by the optic, the hearing by the 8th nerve, the vestibulocochlear or statoacoustic nerve. That the arrangement or the breakdown of the cranial nerves in relation to each column. That's very important to get that part of the breakdown. If you look for the vagus, for example, it's found here, so it has special visceral efferent and general visceral efferent and general visceral afferent and special visceral afferent and general somatic afferent. So it has 5 functions. That's what I would like to know from this. The third nerve, for example, general somatic afferent to the eye muscles and parasympathetic general visceral efferent, and so on. You can get all the, for example, again the trigeminal special visceral afferent for the first arch and general somatic afferent and so on. So you can find out the function of each cranial nerve from this breakdown. The last thing here is to know the nuclei related to each column. In the general somatic efferent group or column, each nucleus take the name of the nerve, that of the oculomotor, of the trochlear, of the abducent, of the hypoglossal. For the special visceral motor fibers, or motor column efferent, the trigeminal have its own name, the facial also had its own name, while those of the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and the cranial part of the accessory will come from the nucleus ambiguous, one nucleus. The 4 parasympathetic nuclei for the third, the Edinger-Westerveld, superior salivary or salivatory nucleus for the facial, inferior salivary for the glossopharyngeal, and dorsal motor nucleus for the vagus. The general visceral afferent, all of them are going to the nucleus solitarius or nucleus of tractus solitarius for the 7th, the 9th, and the 10th. The nucleus solitarius also will receive the test fibers carried by the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. Those for the smell have their own pathway. The general somatic afferent group, the nucleus spinal tract of the trigeminal and the glossopharyngeal and the vagus. 3 of them will come from the nucleus spinal of the spinal tract. The main sensory nucleus will be only for the trigeminal, and the mesencephalic nucleus also for the trigeminal. So the trigeminal will come from the 3 nuclei, the nucleus of spinal tract, of the trigeminal, and the main sensory nucleus, and the mesencephalic nucleus, while the vagus and the accessory from the nucleus of spinal tract. The general somatic afferent fibers, these are the ones, while the special somatic afferent fibers for the vision and the hearing have their own pathways like the smell. So now we got the columns breakdown for the different nerves and the nuclei for the different columns, which you can correlate both of them together. Looking for the nuclei of the oculomotor, for example, you will find it in the first group, motor nucleus, and in the third group, the Edinger-Westerveld. For the vagus, you can listen the nuclei, what we call it the deep origin. That's again arrangement of the nuclei from medial to lateral, as we have seen it in the second slide, or the previous slide, which shows the alar and the basal laminae, the motor and the sensory. And this is enumeration of the nuclei for the general somatic efferent, for the general visceral efferent, for the special visceral efferent, and so on, from 1 to 7. That's a very good one, a good summary of the cranial nerves nuclei, which you can yourself study them separately. That is the trigeminal, for example, the mesencephalic nucleus, the main sensory nucleus in blue, as you can see, and the spinal nucleus of trigeminal. It comes from these 3, and from the motor nucleus of the trigeminal. The third nerve, as you can see here, 1 motor and 1 Edinger-Westerveld. The trochlear, 1 motor only. The abducent, 1 motor only. The facial, you have 3 nuclei here, the solitarius, the superior salivary nucleus, and the motor nucleus, and so on. That is for the Edinger-Westerveld. The nucleus ambiguous is here, giving the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and the accessory. And this is the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. And this is the motor nucleus, spinal nucleus for the accessory nerve. That is the motor nucleus of the hypoglossal, and so on. That's a very good summary for the cranial nerve nuclei.